When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart sank, not from fear of being caught, but because I knew exactly which messages he was about to find. The ones I had meant to delete, the ones I had promised myself were gone. I reached out instinctively to grab the phone back, but he pulled away, steady, unreadable. I watched his face tense, shift, darken as he read line by line. My life began to unravel in real time. He was about to discover the truth, but not all of it. He didn't know how it started. He didn't know what I was feeling. He didn't know how lost I had been. His hands were trembling as he scrolled, and I knew, any second now, he'd reach the message that would change everything. The one that didn't just suggest betrayal, but confirmed it. My phone suddenly vibrated in his hand. A new message lit up the screen. I saw the sender's name. So did he. His face turned pale. Frozen. His eyes locked on the screen, unmoving, unblinking. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit from childhood, when I was scared. The taste of blood grounded me, but it couldn't protect me from what was about to come. His breathing quickened. I could hear it across the room. And just like that, it was happening. The very thing I had feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake. One I can't undo. One that changed everything. Let me tell you how it all began. But before I reveal the truth I tried so hard to bury, leave a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a secret you tried to hide, but in the end, it came out anyway? The first time I noticed the change in myself was a Tuesday morning, sometime in mid-October. The air had started to bite, crisp and dry, and I remember staring at my reflection in the mirror, longer than usual. There was a quiet discontent etched into the corners of my mouth, a dullness in my eyes I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had just been ignoring it for months. Years, even. I touched the collar of my blouse, adjusted the pearl button, and realized I no longer dressed for comfort. I was dressing for something. For someone. At home, things had fallen into a kind of mechanical comfort. My husband was not cruel or inattentive in the traditional sense. He still made coffee for me in the mornings, still reminded me to refill my prescription when the bottle got low. But everything about us felt like a checklist. Touches were brief and utilitarian. Conversations were shallow. What time will you be home? Did you pay the bill? Have you seen my charger? There were no arguments. No big fights. Just silence between the sentences. And sometimes, silence within them. That day at the office, the new regional manager was introduced. He had transferred from the West Division. I remember thinking he was too young for the title, too polished for our dusty little building. He had a quiet presence that didn't ask for attention, but somehow got it anyway. He walked into the room, and people shifted. I stayed at my desk, typing up reports, pretending not to notice him. But I did. We all did. He introduced himself simply, shaking hands with everyone. When he got to me, he paused just long enough for it to register. His handshake was firm, his eyes steady. "You've been here a while," he said. It wasn't a question. I smiled politely. You could say that. Later, I caught myself reapplying lipstick before our department meeting. It wasn't for him. At least, that's what I told myself. Maybe I just wanted to see if anyone would notice the effort. Maybe I just wanted to remember what it felt like to be seen. At the meeting, he asked questions no one had asked before. Not about spreadsheets or metrics, but about people. Culture. Purpose. Things we all claim to care about but rarely discussed. He listened when I spoke. Not the polite kind of listening, but the kind where you feel the weight of someone's attention fully landing on you. It was unnerving. That afternoon, I lingered near the break room longer than necessary. I stood by the coffee machine, waiting for the slow drip to fill my cup when he walked in. There was no pretense, no forced small talk. Just a shared silence, and then, "Long day?" he asked. I nodded. "They all are." He didn't laugh. Just smiled faintly, poured his tea, and left. But it stayed with me. That evening, as I loaded the dishwasher, my husband walked in and asked what was for dinner. Not in a demanding way. Just standard. Default. I told him there was leftover pasta in the fridge, and he nodded without really hearing me. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, scrolling through his phone. "You okay?" I asked. He blinked, looked up. "What?" I didn't repeat myself. Just turned back to the dishes. The silence resumed. The days that followed were ordinary in the most exhausting sense of the word. Work, home, repeat. I found myself looking forward to our morning check-ins at the office. His presence made the air feel different, less heavy. Sometimes he'd stand behind me, reviewing documents on my screen, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my shoulder. Nothing happened. Nothing inappropriate. But it didn't have to. On Friday, he asked if I could stay late to assist with a client file that needed to be rushed before end of week. I agreed, grateful for the excuse. We worked quietly in the conference room, the only light coming from the soft glow of the desk lamp. At some point, he rolled up his sleeves and leaned over the table, his arm brushing mine. I didn't move. Neither did he. When I got home that night, my husband was asleep on the couch with the television still on. The house felt cold. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the back of his head, wondering if he'd wake up and ask where I had been. He didn't. The next morning, I found myself checking my phone more often than usual. I wasn't expecting a message. Not really. But I felt that itch of anticipation. That low buzz in the stomach that says something is shifting. That something has already begun. I told myself I was imagining it. That the moments weren't really moments. That I was reading too much into looks and silences. But I knew better. You always know. It doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow erosion. A gentle drift. A soft opening of a door you swore you'd never unlock. But sometimes, when no one knocks for years, you start to wonder what it would feel like if someone did. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net beneath. Everything looked the same from the outside, routine, harmless, mundane, but inside me, something had shifted. It was as if a door had opened ever so slightly, and behind it was a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. A version who still longed to be noticed, to be wanted, to feel alive. At work, I tried to keep a measured distance. I kept conversations brief, my voice neutral, my expressions carefully composed. But it didn't matter. The air between us had changed. Every time we crossed paths in the hallway, every glance during meetings, every shared silence in the break room carried weight now. I could feel it in my chest, like an invisible string pulling us closer, no matter how hard I tried to resist. That Tuesday, he stopped by my desk with a simple request, to go over some numbers before the end-of-month report. It was a reasonable ask. Professional. But he could have emailed. He could have sent someone else. Instead, he leaned over the edge of my desk, pointing at my screen, close enough that I caught the scent of his cologne. I held my breath without realizing it. He said something about projections, and I nodded, pretending to listen. My mind was too loud. Later that day, he caught me in the parking lot. I had just locked my car and turned to walk back toward the building, having forgotten my badge. He was standing there, alone, sipping from a paper cup. "Long day," he said, almost casually. I nodded, too aware of how quiet the lot was. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" he asked. I looked up sharply. "Pretending what?" He gave a small, half-smile. "That any of this is normal." Then he walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying the moment in my head. Pretending. That was exactly what I was doing, wasn't it? Pretending that my marriage was fulfilling. Pretending that my smiles were sincere. Pretending that nothing was happening, even though my body told me otherwise every time he was near. The next morning, I dressed slower than usual. I chose a navy blouse I hadn't worn in months. I applied mascara twice, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I wanted to recognize myself again. At work, I tried to stay busy, buried in spreadsheets and updates. But as the hours passed, I found myself glancing at the clock more often, listening for footsteps, for the familiar rhythm of his voice outside my office. Around noon, a message appeared on my screen, "Available for a quick chat?" It was from him. My stomach fluttered, stupidly. I typed back, "Sure." 5 minutes? He replied instantly. "I'll wait." We met in the small conference room at the end of the hallway. The blinds were drawn. Neutral territory, I told myself. Professional. Just 2 colleagues reviewing reports. But the moment I stepped inside and closed the door, I felt the weight of the silence between us again. He didn't sit. Neither did I. He opened a folder, started to talk, pointed to a chart. I nodded, said something about the margins. He looked up. "There's a leadership summit next week," he said, as if shifting topics. "They're asking me to bring someone from the team." I knew where this was going before he even finished. "You're the most experienced," he continued. "You'd be perfect." I hesitated, forcing myself to stay calm. "That's unexpected." He tilted his head. "Is that a no?" I looked at him for a long second. "I'll think about it." He smiled again, just slightly. "I hope you say yes." That evening, at home, I brought up the trip over dinner. I told my husband it was optional, but encouraged. Then it would look good for my department. He didn't look up from his plate. "If you want to go, we go." That was all he said. No questions. No curiosity. Just permission. I nodded, more to myself than to him. In bed, I lay awake once again, the ceiling too familiar, too quiet. I imagined the trip, the hotel, the conversations we might have. I imagined feeling like someone again. Not someone's wife, not someone's employee, just someone. The next morning, I accepted the invitation. The days leading up to the summit moved quickly. We coordinated travel plans, separate flights, of course. Separate rooms. Everything by the book. But there was a current running underneath every exchange, every email, every brief hallway conversation. A silent agreement we hadn't spoken aloud. On the morning of the trip, I stood in front of my closet longer than I should have. I chose a soft gray dress, professional, but flattering. I added a scarf, one he had complimented once before, offhandedly. On the way to the airport, I told myself I was imagining things. That nothing had happened. That nothing would happen. But deep down, I knew. When I arrived at the hotel, he was already there. We greeted each other with polite smiles, talked logistics, scheduled our first meeting. Everything was perfectly proper. But our eyes lingered a little too long. Our voices softened a little too much. In the elevator, we stood on opposite sides, the space between us electric. That evening, after the day's presentations, there was a networking event in the hotel lounge. Everyone was there, milling around with glasses of wine and polite small talk. He found me near the back, beside a low table with fruit and cheese. "You surviving?" he asked. I laughed. "Barely." We drifted toward the patio, where the noise faded behind us. The night was cool, and the air smelled faintly of citrus. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the dark cityscape. "You look different here," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Is that a good thing?" He met my eyes. "It's honest." I didn't respond. My heart was too loud in my ears. And then, without warning, we kissed. There were no words. No planning. No logic. Just a moment, suspended in time, where everything else disappeared. The noise, the expectations, the reality waiting back home. All of it vanished. It was just the two of us, standing on the edge of something we couldn't undo. When we finally pulled apart, I looked away. "This was a mistake," I said quietly. He didn't argue. Just nodded. But later, as I lay in bed in that unfamiliar room, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I knew, a mistake or not, something had changed. And there was no going back. The flight back home felt like a strange kind of suspension, somewhere between guilt and denial, between memory and responsibility. I stared out the window for most of it, the clouds like soft blankets layered over a world I no longer felt part of. My phone sat face down on the tray table. I hadn't touched it since we said goodbye in the hotel lobby that morning, when we'd exchanged polite smiles and nothing else. No lingering glances, no secret notes. Just a nod. It felt colder than I expected. Maybe that was the point. I arrived home late in the afternoon. The sun was beginning to dip, stretching shadows across the driveway. As I stepped inside, the air smelled familiar: coffee, dust, a trace of the pine-scented floor cleaner my husband preferred. I stood in the foyer for a moment, suitcase still in hand, listening. The house was quiet. Then I heard the soft hum of the television from the living room. He was sitting on the couch, half reclined, scrolling on his phone. He looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "You're back early." I nodded, setting my bag down. They ended things a bit ahead of schedule. That wasn't exactly a lie. Just not the truth either. He asked if I was hungry. I said no. The conversation ended there. I went upstairs, unpacked in silence, folding each item carefully and placing it back where it belonged. My gray dress went straight to the laundry basket, not because it was dirty, but because I couldn't bear to see it again. I turned on the shower and stood under the hot water until my skin turned pink. I didn't cry. I just let the water fall and hoped it would rinse away the weight I carried. That night, we barely spoke. He dozed off early, the television still flickering in the background. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They looked like the same hands that had typed emails and held mugs of tea and signed birthday cards. But they weren't. Not really. I folded them tightly and climbed under the covers without turning off the lamp. The following days passed in a blur of normalcy. Work resumed with its usual rhythms. Meetings, reports, deadlines. He avoided me. Not openly, not rudely. But I noticed. His emails were concise, his tone sterile. He no longer stopped by my desk. He no longer looked at me the same way. And maybe I deserved that. Or maybe he was protecting us both. I told myself I would focus on my marriage. That I would re-anchor myself in the life I had built. I cooked dinner 2 nights in a row. I folded his laundry before he got home. I suggested we watch one of our old favorite shows together, the one we used to quote lines from. He agreed, though his attention drifted back to his phone before the episode ended. I didn't blame him. I thought about deleting the messages. Every text, every picture, every trace. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. Not yet. I didn't read them, but I didn't erase them either. They sat there, buried deep in the thread, like fingerprints on glass. At work, my colleague Sarah made an offhand comment in the kitchen. Something about how I looked different lately. More relaxed. Or maybe she said less tired. I couldn't remember. I laughed it off, but inside I felt the sting. I wasn't more relaxed. I was unraveling slowly, piece by piece, under the pressure of keeping everything together. One evening, about a week after the summit, I arrived home and found a small bouquet of flowers on the dining room table. No note. I assumed they were from my husband, though he didn't say anything about them. Just gestured toward the table and said, "They had these on sale." I smiled politely, placed them in a vase, and set them near the window. Later that night, I caught myself staring at them too long, wondering what kind of apology could hide in cheap carnations. Sleep became a stranger. I'd lie awake most nights, eyes wide open in the dark, mind running endless loops of what-if scenarios. What if I had said no to that trip? What if I had stopped the kiss? What if I had confessed everything the moment I returned home? But none of those what-ifs mattered now. The truth wasn't just a moment. It was a path I had already stepped onto. And now it stretched behind me and ahead of me, irreversible. The shift between me and my husband was subtle, but steady. He asked fewer questions. I offered fewer answers. He went to bed earlier. I stayed up later. We orbited each other like polite strangers in a shared space, nodding and smiling and maintaining the illusion of peace. Sometimes I wondered if he sensed something. A change in my tone. A flicker in my eyes. Maybe he just didn't want to know. The following Monday, he asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. It caught me off guard. I paused, then nodded. Sure. He chose a quiet Italian place we hadn't been to in years. We sat by the window, ordered our usual dishes, sipped wine slowly. For a moment, it felt like old times. Then he looked at me and said, "You've been distant lately." I froze. The pasta on my fork slipped back onto the plate. I forced a small laugh. Work's been a lot. He didn't challenge me. Just nodded. Took another sip of wine. That was the end of it. Later that night, as we climbed into bed, he reached out to touch my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't move toward him either. We lay like that, fingertips barely grazing, for several minutes before he rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. I stared at the ceiling, feeling the distance stretch farther. At work, things became colder. He, the one I had kissed, barely acknowledged me. We passed in hallways, stood across from each other in meetings, sat near each other in team huddles. But he never looked at me. Not directly. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt hollow. One afternoon, I opened a drawer in my desk and found the folder he had handed me before the trip. Inside was a small note, scribbled in the corner of a printout. "You make things easier." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even personal. But it meant something. Or it used to. Back home, the laundry kept piling up. The dishes were always done, but the silence stayed thick in the air. Every time I looked at my husband, I wondered if he could see it. The change in me. The weight of secrets behind my eyes. And then one night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain tap gently against the windows, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. I turned to check it, half asleep, half hopeful. One message. One name. "I shouldn't miss you. But I do." I didn't respond. I didn't delete it. I just stared at the screen until the letters blurred, and I let the phone slip from my fingers back onto the sheets. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, everything else had already begun to erode. The message lingered in my thoughts for days. I shouldn't miss you. But I do. Just 7 words, yet they weighed more than full conversations I'd had with my husband in months. I didn't reply. I couldn't. But I didn't delete it either. I let it sit there, quietly, like a crack in a window I refused to fix. It didn't shatter anything. Not yet. But I could feel the draft. At work, the days moved forward with sterile precision. He and I kept our distance, but something always hovered between us, something unsaid, something shared. Our conversations, when they happened, were short and functional. But there was always that pause before we spoke, always that flicker of something behind our eyes. Sometimes, it felt like we were both trying to forget at the same time and failing in perfectly synchronized silence. I started noticing little things at home. My husband's new habits. How he'd sit on the edge of the bed at night, scrolling through his phone without saying a word. How he began to sleep with his back turned to me. How he started leaving earlier for work, drinking his coffee alone in the kitchen instead of waiting for me to join him. I noticed, too, how I had stopped asking him how his day was, stopped sitting beside him on the couch, stopped leaning my head on his shoulder during movies we used to watch together. It wasn't anger that filled our house, it was absence. We were both there, breathing the same air, eating the same meals, moving through the same rooms, but the emotional distance between us felt like miles of empty road. Sometimes, I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. There was a question in his eyes, but he never asked it. I don't know if he was afraid of the answer or just tired of the effort. One morning, I arrived at work to find my desk rearranged. A new employee had joined the team, and we had shifted assignments. They moved me to a different floor, farther from him. No explanation was offered, and none was needed. I understood. It was cleaner this way. Safer. But it still hurt more than I expected. The new space felt unfamiliar, colder. The view from the window was of the back parking lot, with dumpsters and loading docks. I told myself it didn't matter. That I was here to work, not to find comfort. Still, every time I glanced up and didn't see the hallway where he used to pass, I felt something like loss. Weeks passed in this new routine. I buried myself in tasks. I stayed late at the office, claiming deadlines. At home, I offered to do the grocery shopping alone, just to be out of the house. I started walking in the evenings, around the neighborhood, letting the rhythm of my steps drown out the noise in my head. One evening, I walked past a small park near our street. There were benches and a cracked fountain that never worked. I sat down and watched the sky darken. I remembered coming here once with my husband years ago, when things were still simple. We had sat on this same bench, sharing a sandwich and laughing at nothing. I tried to recall what we talked about that day. I couldn't. When I got home, he was in the garage, fixing something under the sink. He didn't look up when I entered. I placed the groceries on the counter and started putting them away. The silence stretched between us, thick and impenetrable. I found myself checking my phone again that night. The message was still there, unread. I opened it. Read it again. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, then closed the app without typing a single word. The next day, during a meeting, I felt him enter the room. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. I felt it in the shift of the air, in the tension that pulled tight across my shoulders. He took a seat on the opposite side of the table. We didn't make eye contact. We didn't speak. But I felt everything. After the meeting, as people filtered out, I stayed behind to collect notes. I sensed him behind me, waiting for the last person to leave. When the door clicked shut, he spoke. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you." His voice was quiet. I turned slowly, met his eyes. "You didn't," I said. And it was true. It wasn't him. It was me. It was the way I let it happen. The way I wanted it to happen. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded and walked out. I sat there alone, the echo of his voice still in the room. That night, my husband asked if I wanted to go out for dinner again. I agreed. We went to a small diner we hadn't visited in years. The lighting was soft, the air filled with the scent of fried onions and coffee. We sat in a booth by the window. He asked about my day. I told him about a meeting. He told me about a customer who'd returned a broken appliance. We laughed, a little. It felt almost real. On the way home, he reached for my hand in the car. I let him take it. His palm was warm. Familiar. We didn't speak for the rest of the drive. When we got home, he kissed me on the cheek and said goodnight. I stood in the hallway long after he went upstairs, listening to the quiet house settle around me. The next morning, I found a small note on the kitchen counter. "Have a good day," it said, written in his uneven handwriting. I stared at it for a long moment before tucking it into my purse. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't a forgiveness. But it was something. At work, I kept my head down. I buried myself in spreadsheets and reports. I avoided hallways. I skipped meetings. But the silence inside me only grew louder. One evening, as I stood by the sink washing dishes, I felt a tear slip down my cheek. I wiped it away quickly, unsure if it was from guilt or grief. Maybe both. I didn't know how long I could keep pretending. But I did know that the more I tried to erase what had happened, the more it etched itself into the walls of my mind. It was no longer about what I had done. It was about what I had become. And no matter how many dinners we shared or how many notes he left on the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Not just in my marriage, but in me. The office air felt heavier than usual that morning. It wasn't hotter, or more humid, just dense in the way time becomes when you're waiting for something you can't quite name. I had barely stepped through the main entrance when I saw him. He was walking toward the elevator, a folder in his hand, focused and efficient. But the second his eyes flicked up and met mine, it was as though everything paused. Not dramatically. Not with music swelling or hearts skipping beats. Just a beat of stillness. A breath too long. Then it passed, and he stepped inside without a word. I stood frozen for a second before heading to my desk. My body moved automatically, switch on the monitor, open the planner, take a sip of lukewarm coffee. But I wasn't really there. I was replaying that look, wondering if it meant something, or if I was just too desperate to believe it did. Around mid-morning, he messaged me. A brief line, "Need you on the Delacroix file. Let's go over it today." I replied simply, "Okay." "What time?" He suggested after lunch. My heart thudded a little harder than it should have for something so innocuous. The hours between ticked by with slow cruelty. I tried to lose myself in paperwork, responding to emails, organizing reports. But my thoughts kept circling the same place. When I finally knocked on the door of the small project room we were assigned to use, he was already there, flipping through pages. He gestured to the seat across from him without looking up. We worked quietly. He pointed out figures, I made notes. Occasionally, our hands brushed as we passed pages back and forth. Nothing intentional. Nothing lingering. But my skin tingled every time. I tried to focus on the words, the charts, the client's expectations. but I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye. After we wrapped up, I stood to leave. "Thanks," I said softly, almost automatically. He nodded but didn't speak. As I reached the door, he said, without looking up, "You don't have to pretend with me." I paused, hand on the knob. "I'm not pretending," I said. But I was. We both knew it. I left before he could say anything else. That night, my husband suggested we take a walk after dinner. It was unusual. We hadn't done that in months, maybe longer. The evening was cool, the air thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and something faintly floral from a nearby garden. We walked side by side, not touching, not talking at first. Then he asked if I'd been happy lately. The question caught me off guard. I stumbled slightly, then caught myself. Of course, I answered too quickly. He didn't push. Just nodded slowly, as if logging the response away. When we got home, he went straight to the den, and I stayed in the kitchen cleaning dishes that weren't dirty just to keep my hands moving. I stared out the window over the sink, into the dark backyard. I felt like a guest in my own life. Present, but not rooted. Engaged, but not connected. Later that week, the department hosted a casual after-work gathering. Drinks, small appetizers, low-stakes networking. I almost didn't go, but something in me needed to. Maybe I wanted to see if he'd be there. Maybe I just didn't want to go home yet. He was there, of course. Standing with a small group, sipping from a glass, listening. I stayed across the room, talking with Sarah and a few others. But our eyes met more than once. Not intentionally, not with any message. Just gravity. Eventually, people started to leave. The room thinned. I stepped outside to get some air, the night cooler than I expected. The parking lot was mostly empty, lit in patches by flickering overhead lights. I was about to call a cab when I heard his voice behind me. "Need a ride?" I turned. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, keys in hand. I hesitated. "It's fine, I can." "I'm heading that way anyway," he said, cutting me off gently. I didn't argue. The drive was quiet at first. The radio played something soft. The kind of music that filled spaces without asking for attention. My hands were folded tightly in my lap. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting near the gearshift. I remembered that hand. I remembered how it had once rested on mine. At a red light, he glanced over. "You've been quiet lately." I shrugged. "Just figuring things out." He nodded. "Me too." We didn't say anything else. He didn't ask where I lived, but he remembered. He pulled up in front of my house and stopped the engine, the hum of the car dying into silence. For a moment, I didn't move. I stared at the porch light, the flower pots beside the steps, the curtain slightly parted in the living room window. My husband could be sitting behind that curtain, or he could be upstairs, reading or sleeping. The familiarity of that thought grounded me, and broke something loose inside me at the same time. I turned to thank him, to open the door, to end it. But instead, we kissed. No build-up. No dramatics. Just the quiet pull of something inevitable. His hand brushed my jaw, light as breath, and our mouths met. It lasted seconds. Maybe less. But in that time, the world narrowed to two people in a parked car under the flicker of a faulty streetlight. When we pulled apart, I didn't say a word. Neither did he. I stepped out, closed the door gently behind me, and walked up the path. I didn't look back. Inside the house, everything was still. I toed off my shoes, hung up my coat, and stood in the entryway for a full minute, listening. Upstairs, I heard the soft creak of a bed shifting. He was awake. Or maybe turning in his sleep. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face. My reflection stared back at me with tired eyes and slightly smudged lipstick. I wiped it away with shaking hands. Back in the bedroom, he was lying on his side, facing away. I slipped under the covers without a word. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding with the heaviness of something I couldn't name. I didn't feel elated. I didn't feel romantic. I felt fractured. Like I was living in two places at once, and neither of them belonged to me anymore. Outside, a car drove past slowly. A dog barked in the distance. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe evenly. But sleep didn't come. Only silence. Only the echo of a kiss I couldn't take back. The morning after the kiss, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. It wasn't regret exactly. It wasn't guilt either, not in the traditional sense. It was something heavier, something more complex. The weight of knowing that I had crossed another invisible line, the kind of line you don't even see until it's far behind you. I lay in bed longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of the shower running. My husband was already up, already moving through his morning routine as if nothing had changed. And maybe for him, nothing had. When I finally got out of bed, the house smelled like toast and coffee. He had made breakfast. 2 plates sat on the table, eggs still steaming, slices of bread perfectly golden. It felt like a small peace offering. Or maybe it was just habit. Either way, I sat down, offered a soft good morning, and ate in silence. He asked if I needed gas in my car, if I had any early meetings. I answered each question automatically, like filling out a form. We didn't look each other in the eyes. At work, everything felt sharper. Every sound, typing, printers, footsteps in the hallway, cut through me like static. When I saw him across the office, my chest tightened. He was speaking to a client near the elevators, expression calm and focused. He didn't look my way. And that, somehow, was worse than if he had. I avoided him all morning. Took the long way to the break room. Used the back stairwell instead of the elevator. At lunch, I ate alone at my desk, picking at a salad I didn't want. The dressing tasted like nothing. The lettuce, too soft. I stared at my screen, pretending to work, clicking the same document open and closed more times than I could count. Sometime in the early afternoon, a message popped up on my phone. Just a single line from him, "I'm sorry." No punctuation. No context. But I knew exactly what it meant. I stared at the words, heart pounding, unsure whether to respond. I didn't. Not right away. I closed the message, locked my phone, and slid it into my drawer. By the time I got home, it was raining. Not a storm, just a steady, gray drizzle that blurred the windows and made the world feel softer, quieter. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes, watching the water bead on the windshield. I wasn't ready to go inside yet. I wasn't ready to play the part of the wife who had everything under control. When I did finally step through the front door, the house was warm. The lights were on. The television was playing some sports commentary show I didn't recognize. My husband was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. He turned when he heard me and offered a tired smile. I thought I'd make soup. Seemed like a soup kind of night. I nodded. Yeah. It does. I changed out of my damp clothes, pulled on a soft sweater, and joined him. We moved around each other in the kitchen like dance partners who had long since learned the steps. I stirred while he added spices. He handed me the salt without being asked. We didn't say much, but there was a comfort in the familiarity. We ate together at the table. The soup was simple: carrots, celery, chicken broth, but it was warm and for a while, that was enough. He asked how work was. I said it was fine. He mentioned a neighbor's tree leaning over the fence. I pretended to care. We made it through the meal without awkward silences, but the quiet afterward was deafening. That night, I lay awake again. The house was still. My husband's breathing was even beside me. I turned toward the window, watching the rain trail down the glass in slow, curving lines. My mind replayed everything, his text, the kiss, the note he had left in the file weeks ago. Every small moment that had led me here, to this space between two lives. I thought about what it would mean to tell the truth. Not just to confess the kiss, but to explain how I got to this point. To admit that I had stopped feeling wanted, that I had stopped feeling seen. That I had gone searching for something I couldn't even name. I imagined his face, how it would change, how it might not. I imagined silence. Or yelling. Or him leaving. Or me leaving. The next day, I deleted the message. Not as an act of closure, but as an act of survival. I knew I wasn't strong enough to have it sitting there, glowing quietly in my pocket, waiting for me to fall again. I didn't reply. I didn't say anything. I just erased it and hoped it would take some of the weight with it. At work, I avoided him again. Not out of anger. Not out of shame. Just because I didn't know how to be around him anymore. Something about the simplicity of it before, the glances, the conversations, had turned into something else. Something with consequences. And I wasn't ready to face them. Toward the end of the day, we crossed paths near the stairwell. We both paused, too close to pretend we hadn't seen each other. I forced a small smile. He gave me a nod. Then we passed, wordless. That was it. And still, I felt something inside me shift again, like a foundation settling in an old house. At home, my husband was working on his laptop in the den. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him. His hair had started to gray at the temples. His shoulders were a little more slouched than they used to be. But he looked calm. Steady. Real. He looked like a man who had built a life and was still trying, even if he didn't always know how. I wanted to walk over and sit beside him. To tell him I missed us. That I wasn't sure where we had gone wrong. But I didn't. I went to the kitchen instead and made tea. I stood at the sink and stared out the window again. The rain had stopped. The sky was a dark, dense blue, streaked with the last hints of daylight. Later, when we were both in bed, I rolled over and looked at him. He was still awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "I've been tired lately," I said quietly. He turned his head. "Me too." We lay there, facing each other in the dark, both exhausted in ways neither of us knew how to fix. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe the only way back was through. Through the hurt. Through the silence. Through the slow, painful work of rediscovering what we had once promised to protect. But I didn't say any of that aloud. I just reached out and touched his hand. He didn't pull away. He didn't say anything. But he held on. The first thing I remember about that night was the stillness. Not the kind that calms you, but the kind that makes your skin feel too tight. The kind that arrives just before something breaks. It had been an unusually hot day for the season, and even though the sun had long since disappeared, the air remained heavy, humid, unmoving. Our bedroom window was cracked, but there was no breeze, just the occasional sound of tires rolling over the street outside and the faint hum of insects somewhere in the trees. I hadn't planned anything. There was no intention. No decision. But sometimes, all it takes is a pause in routine, a moment when no one is looking, for the unthinkable to slip through. That evening had started like many others. I came home a little later than usual, citing a last-minute report. My husband was in the kitchen, reheating leftovers. We ate in silence, side by side at the counter, watching the news flicker on the small television mounted near the fridge. There was nothing memorable about the conversation. Just the kind of small talk that fills the space where connection used to live. After dinner, he mentioned a migraine. Said he was going to lie down early. I nodded and told him I'd finish cleaning up. He didn't kiss me goodnight, but he rarely did anymore. The door to the bedroom clicked shut behind him. I stood in the kitchen with my hands in soapy water, scrubbing plates that were already clean, heart pounding for reasons I didn't understand at the time, or maybe I did. I checked my phone. No new messages. I almost felt relieved. Then, just as I was drying the last dish, it vibrated in my hand. One message. One name. Still awake? I stared at the screen, breath caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. It wasn't a question that needed an answer. It was an invitation. One I could decline. One I should decline. But I didn't. I typed, yes. He replied almost immediately, I'm near. I didn't ask what he meant by that. I didn't need to. My hands were trembling as I dried them on the towel. I glanced at the closed bedroom door. The soft hum of the white noise machine we kept by the bed was barely audible. He was asleep. I walked to the front door and opened it slowly, careful not to let it creak. The night outside was still, warm, thick. The porch light cast a dull yellow halo onto the steps. I didn't see him at first, but then he stepped into the glow, as if summoned by the thought alone. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We stood there for a moment, suspended between hesitation and momentum. I stepped aside. He walked in. There was no rush. No frenzy. Just quiet understanding. We moved like people who had danced this pattern before, even if only in dreams. Every step felt inevitable. The house felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Even the air smelled different. Like something had shifted in the foundation. We sat on the couch in the dim light of the hallway lamp. A glass of water stood half full on the coffee table. The silence stretched and stretched until it became its own presence in the room. He looked at me, not with lust or possession, but with something softer. Sadder. Like he already knew what this would cost. I don't remember who moved first. Maybe we both did. Maybe the space between us simply ceased to exist. We spent the night together. It happened as naturally as rain falling. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet surrender. And afterward, we didn't speak. We just sat there, side by side, in the dim, sticky air of a house too quiet for what had just occurred. At some point near dawn, I stood and walked to the window. The sky was beginning to pale, tinged with lavender and gray. The street was empty. The world, still sleeping. He came up behind me and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. I closed my eyes. I should go, he said. I nodded. He left without another word. I watched his car disappear down the street, headlights dimming into the distance. I didn't cry. I didn't move for a long time. I stood there, barefoot on the cool tile floor, heart thudding so loudly I thought it might wake the entire neighborhood. The house remained still. Upstairs, my husband was likely still sleeping. Dreaming. Unaware. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step a weight. In the bathroom, I washed my face, stared at the reflection of a woman I barely recognized. She looked older. Not from time, but from truth. When I finally slipped into bed beside him, he stirred slightly, then settled again. I lay on my back, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't stop replaying it. The way he had looked at me. The way I hadn't hesitated. The way it hadn't felt like a mistake, only a consequence. Sleep never came. That morning, I moved through the motions like a shadow. I dressed, made coffee, folded laundry. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work. I nodded as he said something about dinner. The moment the door closed, I leaned against the wall and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Everything still looked the same. The walls, the furniture, the folded towels in the linen closet. But nothing was the same. I knew there would be no going back. No matter how many breakfasts we shared, no matter how many smiles we rehearsed. I had crossed a line, and there were no footprints to follow back. Only silence. Only consequence. Only me. I thought the silence the next morning would feel different. He was gone before the sun came up, and I assumed he had planned it that way. No lingering goodbyes. No text. No sign he had ever been in the house. And yet everything he touched seemed louder now, more visible. The indent on the couch cushion. The faint scent of his cologne on the hallway air. The misplaced coffee mug that didn't belong to my husband. I moved through the kitchen slowly, every action measured. Open cabinet. Pour cereal. Add milk. I sat at the table, chewing without appetite. The spoon scraped against the bowl like a metronome, ticking away the seconds of a life I no longer fully recognized. Every detail of the room seemed to pulse with meaning. The chipped tile near the fridge. The sunlight slanting across the floor. The unopened mail on the counter. When my husband finally appeared, hair still wet from the shower, he gave me a sleepy nod. "You're up early," he mumbled, reaching for the coffee pot. I swallowed hard and nodded. Couldn't sleep. He didn't ask why. Maybe he didn't want to know. Maybe he already knew. As he sipped his coffee, he scrolled through something on his phone. The ease of it, the normalcy, was disorienting. I wondered what I looked like to him in that moment. The same woman who had made his dinner 100 times. The same woman who folded his laundry and paid the bills and reminded him to take his vitamins. Did he notice the change? Did he see the edges fraying? When he left for work, I closed the door behind him and leaned against it. The house exhaled with me, both of us holding something too big to name. I stood there for a long time, palms flat against the wood, as if I could keep everything inside from falling apart. Later, I opened my phone and stared at the messages. Nothing new. No follow-up. No apology. No attempt to rewrite what had happened. It felt deliberate. I put the phone face down on the counter and walked away. I spent most of that day cleaning. Not because the house was dirty, but because I needed something to do with my hands. I wiped baseboards. Scrubbed grout. Emptied every drawer in the bathroom and reorganized the contents. The distraction helped, until it didn't. Around mid-afternoon, I found myself back in the living room, sitting on the couch where we had sat together just hours before. I stared at the blank television screen and tried to remember what had been playing the last time I watched something with my husband. It felt like a lifetime ago. I picked up the remote, then set it back down. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. I told myself that was good. That space was healthy. That silence was a form of mercy. The next few days unfolded like clockwork. Work. Home. Sleep. Repeat. We didn't speak about anything deeper than schedules or groceries. He mentioned the heater in the guest room making a weird noise. I nodded and said we should call someone to check it. He said he'd handle it. I let him. Every now and then, I thought about telling him. Not about the kiss. Not about the night. But about everything else. The slow erosion of connection. The way I had started to feel invisible. How I sometimes woke up wondering who I had become, and whether there was a way back. But I didn't say any of it. I folded the words into the laundry, pressed them into the sheets, rinsed them down the sink with the coffee grounds. One night, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was just past 2 in the morning. My husband was sleeping beside me, his breathing deep and steady. I reached for the phone with trembling fingers. It was from him. "I'm sorry for everything. I shouldn't have come." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I locked the phone, turned it face down, and lay there in the dark, blinking up at the ceiling. I didn't respond. The next morning, I deleted the message without reading it again. At work, things were noticeably colder. We passed in the halls without acknowledgement. We attended meetings without making eye contact. It was professional. Controlled. But under the surface, something buzzed. The awareness of what had happened. The impossibility of forgetting. Sarah, my colleague, commented once that I seemed distracted. "Everything okay?" she asked gently as we walked back from the break room. I nodded too quickly. "Just tired." She didn't press. One afternoon, I caught sight of him across the office, speaking with a new employee. He laughed at something she said, hand resting on the back of her chair in a way that once would have made my stomach flutter. This time, it felt like a closing door. Not jealousy. Not even sadness. Just a quiet, final click. That evening, I arrived home to find my husband in the garage, cleaning out old boxes. Dust floated in the air like memories stirred loose. He showed me a box of photographs from our early years' vacations, birthdays, candid snapshots of us smiling in places I barely remembered. I looked at my own face in those pictures, younger, lighter. "Crazy how fast time moves," he said. I nodded. It really is. Later that night, I stood at the bathroom mirror, brushing my hair. I studied the fine lines near my eyes, the subtle sag in my jawline. I wasn't young anymore. I wasn't who I used to be. But I also wasn't finished. Back in bed, my husband reached for my hand. He held it loosely, like he had done that night when I thought I might fall apart. This time, I squeezed back. The silence didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became something we both felt, something we both carried. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel alone in it. But I also knew it wouldn't be enough. Not forever. The season began to shift. Mornings became crisper, the sunlight gentler, slanting through the blinds at angles that hinted at autumn. I found myself moving slower in the mornings, standing by the window with my coffee longer than I used to, as though hoping the quiet would offer answers I hadn't been able to find inside myself. At work, the days passed in stillness. I buried myself in tasks, staying late more often than I needed to, just to avoid going home. The space between him and me had grown wide and impassable, yet somehow it remained present in everything I did. We hadn't spoken since his message. There were no stolen glances, no lingering tension. Just distance. Cold, professional, deliberate distance. And then, one Thursday afternoon, his office door was closed. A rare occurrence. A few hours later, an internal announcement was sent to the team: he was being transferred to another regional division. Effective immediately. The words were brief. No farewell gathering. No explanation. Just a sterile line about continuity in leadership and new opportunities. I stared at the message, reading it 3 times. Then I closed the email and sat in silence, unsure what to feel. Relief? Sadness? Shame? By the time I gathered the courage to walk past his office, it was already empty. The blinds were open, the desk bare. A chair pushed in neatly, as if no one had ever sat there. It felt like a ghost had passed through, leaving no trace. I didn't ask where he had gone. I didn't want anyone to look at me and wonder why I cared. That evening, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, but not empty. My husband was sitting on the front porch, a small notebook in his hands, legs stretched out. I hadn't seen him there in months. He looked up when I pulled into the driveway and gave me a faint smile. I joined him without speaking. We sat side by side as the light faded, neither of us touching the notebook now resting on his knee. The air between us felt less strained, but still uncertain, like two people cautiously holding the edges of something fragile. "I've been thinking," he said after a long pause. "About us." I didn't respond right away. My hands were folded in my lap, knuckles tight. "I don't know when it happened," he continued, "but I feel like we stopped seeing each other." The words landed softly, but firmly. I nodded. "I know." He looked out at the street. "It's not just you. It's not just me either. I think we both let it happen." I swallowed hard. I kept telling myself it was just a phase. That it would pass. "And did it?" he asked, gently. I didn't answer. We sat in silence again, the sky darkening above us. A car passed slowly down the street. A dog barked in the distance. The kind of quiet that feels like it might turn into something deeper if you let it. He tapped the notebook lightly. "I've been writing things down. Things I want to say but never seem to." I glanced over. "Like what?" "Small stuff. Big stuff. Things I miss. Things I don't know how to talk about without making it worse." His voice wasn't angry. It was tired, but open. I felt a sudden ache in my chest, not just for the distance between us, but for the years we had filled with silence instead of truth. "I think I've been disappearing," I said quietly. "Not all at once. Just little pieces of me at a time." He didn't say anything right away. Then, softly, "I know." We stayed outside until the porch light came on automatically. Eventually, we went inside, each of us retreating to different rooms without saying much more. But something in the air had shifted. Not healed. Not forgiven. But acknowledged. In the days that followed, we spoke more. Not about the past, not about the things that had happened, but about small, practical matters. Who would pick up groceries? Whether we should replace the hallway rug. It wasn't intimacy, but it was movement. One afternoon, I opened a drawer in the hallway and found a framed photo from years ago, our anniversary trip to the coast. We were both smiling, squinting against the sun, arms loosely around each other. I didn't remember feeling particularly happy in that moment, but in the photo, we looked whole. I set the photo on the kitchen counter, then stood there for a long time, wondering whether the life I had once built with him was still salvageable, or whether we were just learning how to part without completely falling apart. A few days later, I came home to find a bouquet of tulips on the dining table. There was no card, but I knew they were from him. He had remembered I liked them. I touched one of the petals, soft and delicate, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to calm. That night, as we sat on the couch watching television, he reached over and held my hand. It was a small gesture. No words. Just the gentle pressure of fingers wrapping around mine. I didn't pull away. But as the evening wore on, my thoughts drifted elsewhere. Not to him. Not even to the man who had gone. But to myself, who I had become. The quiet truth was that I wasn't mourning the loss of either man. I was mourning the version of myself I had left behind somewhere in between. I realized then that no one was going to save me from that. Not my husband, not a fleeting romance, not anyone. I would have to do it myself, rebuild, reclaim, redefine. And maybe that started by simply telling the truth. Not to anyone else. Just to me. That weekend, I took a walk through a nearby park. The trees were beginning to turn. Reds, golds, a few leaves already fallen to the path. I found a bench by the lake and sat with a notebook of my own, blank pages waiting. I didn't write about either man. I didn't write about guilt or betrayal. I wrote about stillness. About waiting too long. About learning to listen to the voice inside that whispers before it screams. I wrote about wanting to start over. Not with someone new. Just with myself. The last warm day of the season came quietly. I noticed it not by the temperature itself but by the light, how it filtered through the curtains with a softness that felt final, as though the sun knew it would soon be retreating behind clouds for weeks at a time. I stood at the kitchen window that morning with a cup of tea in my hands, watching leaves twist lazily to the ground. There was a hush in the air, like the world was pausing to take a breath. Inside the house, things had reached an odd equilibrium. My husband and I no longer danced around the silence between us. Instead, we filled it with neutral conversation, practical tasks, shared routines. There was no open affection, but there was no anger either. Just two people walking through the remnants of something that once had been fuller. I hadn't heard from him since he left. No messages. No accidental meetings. Nothing. At first, I checked my phone compulsively, waiting for some kind of aftershock. But now, weeks later, I no longer expected anything. The silence had become its own kind of answer. That morning, my husband suggested we go through the attic, before the cold sets in, he said. I agreed without hesitation. Maybe I welcomed the distraction, or maybe I was looking for something in the boxes and bins that could explain how we got here. We spent most of the afternoon pulling down old storage containers, sorting through forgotten holiday decorations, and used appliances, and boxes of photographs. There was something grounding about the dust, the clutter, the evidence of life that had once been busier, louder, more certain. In one of the boxes, tucked beneath a stack of greeting cards, I found an old journal of mine. The cover was soft from years of handling, and I knew instantly from the bent corner that it had traveled with me through more than one move. I held it for a moment, unsure whether I wanted to open it. My husband didn't notice. He was sorting through a bin of cables and outdated electronics, cursing softly at a tangle of chargers. I slipped the journal into the pocket of my sweater and said nothing. Later, when the sun began to dip and the wind picked up outside, I went upstairs alone and sat on the edge of the bed with the journal in my lap. I hesitated before opening it, afraid of what my past self might say, of how familiar, or foreign, she might feel. The first few pages were filled with small, hopeful entries. Notes about work. A few sketches. Lists of things to remember. But as I flipped further, the tone shifted. There were questions. Doubts. Longings I hadn't remembered writing down. I miss being looked at like I matter. That sentence hit me the hardest. I read it again. And again. Not because it was surprising, but because it had been true long before anything ever happened. I set the journal aside and stood at the window. The yard was quiet, the trees nearly bare now. I remembered planting one of those trees the year we moved in. It had been barely taller than me. Now, it towered over the fence, its branches stark and beautiful against the sky. My husband came in and sat beside me on the bed. We didn't speak. He reached for my hand, not searching or pleading, just a gentle touch. I let him take it. We sat like that until the sky turned deep blue. Eventually, he said, I think we should take a break. My heart slowed. What kind of break? Not a punishment. Not an ending. He paused. Just space. I turned toward him. You already knew, didn't you? His face didn't change. He looked down at our hands. I didn't have proof. But I didn't need it. I nodded. It wasn't just him. I know. We sat in silence again, and this time it wasn't awkward. It was honest. That weekend, he packed a small bag and said he'd stay with his brother for a while. We didn't fight. We didn't cry. He kissed my forehead before leaving. I closed the door gently behind him. The house felt different almost immediately. Not emptier. Just unmasked. That night, I made myself dinner for one and ate in silence. I washed the dishes slowly, wiped down the counters, turned off the lights one by one. I didn't check my phone. I didn't open my laptop. I simply existed. Before bed, I pulled the journal out again. I flipped to the back and wrote one simple line. I'm ready to be someone I recognize again. In the following weeks, I began rebuilding. Not through dramatic changes, but through small, intentional acts. I signed up for a weekend writing class. I cleaned out my closet. I reached out to an old friend for lunch, and we sat in a cafe for hours, talking like no time had passed. I thought about him sometimes, the man who had left, the one who came and went like a lesson. I didn't miss him, not really. I missed what he awakened in me. The reminder that I could still feel. That I was still alive beneath all the routine and expectation. One afternoon, while reorganizing the bookshelf, I came across a photo tucked between two novels. It was from a staff conference years ago. I was standing near a window, laughing, sunlight catching my hair. I didn't remember the moment, but I remembered the feeling. I didn't throw the photo away. But I didn't frame it either. I placed it inside a book of essays and closed it gently. A few days later, my husband texted. I'd like to talk soon. I replied simply, me too. I didn't know where the conversation would lead. I didn't know what would come next. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid of what was ahead. I had lived through the unraveling. I had faced the mirror and chosen not to look away. And now, maybe, I could begin again. Not from scratch. But from truth.